I didn't expect anyone to find me there, not in that place where the light had stopped reaching years ago, where I had folded myself into silence and grown used to the weight of being unseen. Wasn't grief that kept me in the dark, it was the comfort of not having to explain, not having to smile when I couldn't, not having to be okay just to be allowed to exist. Most people don't look too closely. They see the laugh, the nod, the I'm fine, and keep walking, but not them they saw. Something else, something even I had forgotten existed. They didn't just look, they stayed somehow. Without touching the darkness, they made it feel less lonely. I didn't wake up one day and decide to disappear. I just started answering less, smiling less, showing up less. Eventually, the world adjusted. Like I was never really there to begin, with the calls, stopped the doors, stayed closed, and the silence. Settled in thick, still heavy, I learned to carry it tad. First I resented the weight, tried to shake it off, tried to make myself loud again. Present again, but no one noticed, so I let it stay. Silence became familiar. A kind of armor, a kind of punishment. Sat in rooms full of people and felt like wallpaper, present, but unnoticed. I started writing less, stopped singing, stopped sharing the little things I loved. What was the point when no one was listening anyway? Even grief started to feel quiet, like it had grown tired of crying and had curled itself into a corner inside me to sleep. That's where I lived, in the quiet. In the numb, I walked through days like a shadow, a flicker of something, but not enough to hold him. No one asked why, no one asked if I was okay. They just said, "You've been quiet lately," and moved on. But then one day, someone didn't move on. They asked, and then they waited, and then they stayed. At first, I didn't know what to do with that. They didn't fill the space with noise. They didn't rush to fix me. They just sat there. Like they weren't afraid of what they couldn't sit. Wasn't a grand gesture, no speeches, no declarations. Just presence, unshaking, unbothered by the dark. They said, "You don't have to talk. I just don't want you to be alone in there." And I didn't answer, but something in me cracked, not broken, just shifted. I didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even look at them, but I didn't walk away either. And that for me was a beginning. We didn't talk about it after. They never asked me to explain. The next day, they showed up again. Same silence, same steadiness. They brought coffee, sat on the other end of the couch, and scrolled quietly through their phone. But every few minutes, they glanced up just to see if I was still breathing. I wasn't. For the first time in weeks, I noticed the taste of coffee again, not because it had changed, but because I had just a little, just enough to notice that I wasn't completely invisible. That maybe someone saw the shadow I had become and didn't turn away. They didn't ask for stories. They didn't ask for pain. They didn't dig. They just offered space, and slowly, that space became a kind of shelter, not a cure, not a fix, but something softer, something safer. I started looking forward to their visits, not with excitement, but with relief, the kind of relief that comes from knowing you won't have to pretend today. They never made me feel guilty for being quiet, never said you used to be so funny, or why don't you come out more. They just let me be and stayed anyway. That was unfamiliar. Most people only stay for the light, but they came for the dark and didn't flinch. They told me about their day, sometimes small stories, funny things, the way their cat knocked over a plant, or how they spilled tea on their bookhand. Even when I didn't respond, they kept sharing, not to fill the silence, but to give it warmth. Like they were saying, "You don't have to talk, but you still get to feel included." And I did eventually, started nodding, smiling just a little, and they noticed. They always noticed, never made it a big deal, just smiled back like they were waiting for that moment, but never needed it to come. That's what made it safe there. Love was never impatient. They once said, "I don't need you to be okay. I just need you to be real with me." And I believed them because nothing about them felt like pressure or performance or pity. They weren't here to rescue me. They were just here, and that was enough. We didn't talk about healing or hope or mental health. We just existed together, and somehow that was louder than all the advice in the world. They started leaving little things behind. A book, they thought. I might like a scarf, an extra mugget, was their way of rooting themselves into the silence. I lived in not intruding, just reminding me that someone saw the space I thought was invisible. They told me once, I just want you to know you're not hard to care for, and I almost cried because I had believed the opposite for so long, that I was too distant, too cold, too complicated. But they didn't try to simplify me. They just stayed curious. They asked, how's your heart today? Even if I didn't answer, they asked anyway. And one day I did answer, not with words, but with a look, a sigh, a soft, I don't know. And they smiled and said, that's okay. You don't have to know. I'll be here either way. That was the moment I realized they weren't afraid of my darkness, and maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to be either. It took time to believe it, that they meant it, that this wasn't a performance or a temporary kindness. That they weren't here because they had nothing better to do. Tested it without meaning to. Without trying, but I did. Some days I pulled away. Stopped replying again, waited to see how long it would take for the silence to scare them off. Never did they, never demanded I show up. They never said you're being distant again. They just sent a message thinking of you, no pressure to reply, just still here, and that did something to the walls I had built, because love that doesn't demand begins to loosen everything built from fear. They didn't reward me for being okay, didn't ignore me when I wasn't there, was no transaction, no earning, just presence. That's when I started to open a little more. I asked them once, what made you stay? They smiled, shrugged, said, because it matters to me that you know someone would. And for the first time, I wanted to believe that was enough. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real, and real love is quiet like that. Sometimes it shows up in small ways. In making 2 mugs of tea instead of 1, in checking the weather before sending a text, in remembering how you like your toast, in waiting at the edge of your silence without asking for the door to open. They did all of that, and eventually that door creaked open. I began sharing stories, not the big ones, not the ones that still hurt, but little things. Told them about a dream I had where I was flying, but only just above the ground, never quite lifting, never quite falling. They said, that sounds like where you've been living for a while. In between hovering, I blinked, surprised they saw it so clearly. They always did. Their words didn't sting, they soothed, because they weren't trying to analyze me. They were just reflecting what I already knew, what I hadn't yet said out loud, and saying things out loud with them didn't feel like a risk. It felt like letting the darkness breathe. That was new before them. Any time I let someone in, they tried to clean it up, fix it, offer advice. They treated my pain like a problem, and it made me feel like one too, but they didn't. They never rushed me into hope. They never handed me solutions. They just handed me a seat beside them and said, you don't have to walk through this alone. You don't have to walk at all today. You can just rest here. And so I rested for the first time in months, years, maybe rested without guilt, without explaining, without needing to apologize for how long I stayed tired. That was the beginning of healing, not the healing people talk about in movies, not the tear-filled montage with inspiring music. Quiet kind, the kind that looks like breathing, like brushing your hair again, like walking around the block just to feel something move. They noticed those things the first day I wore something I hadn't in a while. They smiled, didn't say anything. Grant, just you look like you again, or maybe more like who you were always meant to be. I didn't respond, but I heard it. Felt it, because they never said things to fix me. They said them because they saw my end. I was learning how to see myself too, through their eyes, not perfectly, not completely, but gently. For the first time, I told them once. It still hurts sometimes, even when things are good, and they said, that makes sense. Hurt doesn't always leave when the light comes in. Sometimes it stays, but now it doesn't have to stay alone. That stayed with me because I'd spent so long trying to chase out the pain, trying to be whole, trying to be better. But better doesn't always mean perfect, and wholeness isn't about never breaking. It's about loving the pieces while they're still scattered. They taught me that without teaching it, just by being what they were, consistent, kind, still they never praised me for pretending to be okay, only for being honest when I wasn't. He started answering differently when people asked, "How are you?" Instead of "I'm fine," I'd say somewhere in the middle, but I'm okay with that today. And when I told them that, they nodded, said, "I'm proud of that middle." That's where the real living happens. I believed them, because by now their words had carved soft truths into all the hard places inside me. Not all the darkness had gone, but now there was light in it, and the light didn't hurt anymore. It didn't burn, didn't blind, it just warmed, and in that warmth I started coming back to life in small ways, real ways that didn't need applause, only room to growth. They gave me that room, that soil, that time, and when I asked, "What if I go back again? What if I slip?" said, "Then I'll hold your hand until you're ready to try again. We're not doing this on a timer." And I believed them because everything in their presence said, "You are allowed to fall, and you are still lovable when you do." It wasn't that the darkness disappeared, it's that it changed shape. Used to feel like drowning. Now it felt like standing in a quiet room with the lights dimmed low. Still present, still real, but no longer unbearable. There was air in the room. Now I could breathe because of them, not because they lit it up like a firework, not because they filled it with laughter or noise, but because they sat with me in it and made the silence feel like home instead of exile. That was the difference. They never knocked on the door of my sadness asking to be let in. They waited by it quietly until I opened it myself, and when I did, they walked through slowly. Without questions, without hesitation. They didn't say, "Cheer up," or "It could be worse," or "You should be grateful." They just looked at me and said, "I see you." Those 3 words were a kind of medicine I didn't know I needed, a kind of balm. I never thought I'd be worthy. I see you, not as broken, not as dramatic, not as needy, just as a person doing their best in the quietest way possible. That's what I had always been: quiet about my pain, silent about my wounds, still on the outside, screaming on the inside. But now I had a voice beside me, not speaking for me, just whispering, "I'm here, I'm staying, I don't need you to shine for me to love you." I'd never heard that before. Most people love you when you're easy to love, when you're funny, charming, helpful. But what about when you're tired, withdrawn, confused? What about when the best you can do is get out of bed and sit on the floor for an hour? They loved me then, too. That's what changed me, not loud healing, but quiet understanding. One evening, they brought over a record player, old vinyls crackling, jazz and dusty strings. We didn't talk, just listened. On somewhere in that moment, with the lights low and the music playing and their presence steady beside me, realized I wasn't waiting for someone to save me anymore. I was just grateful someone didn't walk away. Told them I still feel empty some days. They nodded, me too. There was no advice after that, no plan, just truth. We were 2 people in a room, holding space for each other's hollow places without trying to fill them. And in that, I felt full, not of answers, not of hope, but of the kind of peace that comes from being understood. They never looked at me like I was a project or a problem or a puzzle to be solved. They looked at me like I was a person with wounds and warmth and worth. They never tried to label what we were, never pushed it into a box. They just called it being human together. And that was enough for me, more than enough, because I didn't need a love that rescued me. I needed a love that sat beside me. While I learned to rescue myself, they did that again and again and again, with soup when I forgot to eat, with silence when I couldn't speak, with light touch on my shoulder when I was lost in thought. Their love was so quiet, it echoed on in the echo. I heard something I hadn't heard in years. My own voice, unfiltered, soft, really started writing again. First in a notebook I kept hidden, then slowly I began sharing pieces. I read them, a paragraph one night about loneliness, and how sometimes the scariest part isn't being alone, it's being with people who make you feel like you still are. I finished. I looked at them nervously, bracing for judgment. They just looked at me, eyes soft, and said, "That's beautiful." Because it's honest, and honesty is always beautiful. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until I had spent so long censoring myself, cutting out parts of my story that felt too much, too raw, too sad, but with them nothing felt too much, even when I cried without knowing why, even when I didn't want to talk for days, even when I second-guessed every kind thing they said. They stayed not to fix it, but to witness it tan slowly. That witnessing made me brave enough to start answering truthfully, brave enough to show up when I wanted to hide, brave enough to believe that maybe I was worth staying for, not because I was perfect, but because I was real. And in that room with them, I learned that real is enough always. There's a moment in healing that doesn't announce itself, doesn't arrive with a sunrise or a dramatic gesture. It just appears, like one day you wake up and realize the quiet doesn't hurt anymore. It's still quiet, but it no longer echoes. With loneliness, it simply holds you softly, like a blanket around the parts that used to feel cold. That's what that day felt like. They arrived same way as always, a knock that didn't expect a response, a bag of pastries, 2 mugs of tea, and I was already sitting in the window, looking out at nothing. They didn't ask me to move, didn't ask what was on my mind, just walked over, placed the tea beside me. I sat on the floor and leaned back against the wall, and we were just there, breathing, existing, in sync without trying to beg. Don't know how long we stayed like that, an hour or 2 maybe, but it was the first time I didn't feel the urge to fill the space. I wasn't performing, wasn't measuring their presence, wasn't preparing to be left. I was just safe. That word safe used to feel Faruni, had been loved before, but never safely, never without cost. There was always a condition, a timeline, an expectation, but not with them. They loved me like it was second nature, like it was the most normal thing in the world to see someone's cracks and call them light. That day, I asked almost out of nowhere, "Why are you like this?" They smiled, didn't look up, just said, "Because someone once sat with me when I didn't know how to come back to life." And I never forgot what that felt like. And that was it. Not a story, not a sermon, just a shared memory of pain, passed forward as compassion. I think we all carry those stories, the ones we don't talk about, that shape the way we show up for others. And in that moment, I realized their gentleness wasn't just kindness. It was lived in, earned, real. It made me want to be that for someone else one day, to sit beside their silence and not need to break it. Oh, say, "You're not alone," without ever opening my mouth. That kind of love changes people, not because it demands change, but because it gives permission to soften, to unfold, to return. That day, I started humming again, not a song, just a sound, a note that floated into the air before I could catch it. They looked up, eyes wide, grinning. Was that a hum? I shrugged, blushed, looked down. They didn't push, didn't praise, just smiled like it was the most beautiful thing they'd heard all weekend. Maybe it was because it meant I was coming back to myself, to sound too live. Started leaving the lights on in my apartment again, started cracking the windows, letting the air move through the stillness. The darkness wasn't gone, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. It was part of the room, not the whole room. And they never tried to force the light in. They simply waited with me until I opened the curtains myself. There's power in that kind of patience. One evening we cooked together something simple, pasta, garlic bread. They danced in the kitchen when the timer went off, sang along to a song I barely remembered from years ago. I didn't join in, but I watched, smiled, and I didn't feel distant. I felt included, even in my stillness. That's what they did, made space for joy without making it a requirement. And slowly my body started remembering what it felt like to enjoy things. Food tasted like something again. My feet started tapping without permission. Laughter escaped my lips, unforced, sudden, really laughed. And they looked up, eyes full, like they'd been waiting for that sound for years. They didn't say, "There you are," but I could feel it in their gaze. And for once, didn't scare me to be seen. It felt like home, not a place, not a destination, just being looked at and loved without needing to be anything other than who I was in that moment. That's what healed me, not time, not therapy, not answers, just someone staying again and again and again till I realized the darkness could be shared, and when shared, it didn't feel like drowning, it felt like floating. Not every day was golden. Not every morning came with light. Some days still felt heavy. Some thoughts still returned like old ghosts. But something had shifted. I stopped feeling like I had to outrun it. All there was a strange kind of peace in knowing that even if the ache returned, so would they. They didn't disappear on the hard days. They didn't grow tired of the quiet ones. They just adjusted, slowed their pace, matched mine. That was the most beautiful part. They never tried to lead. They simply walked beside me. Even on the days I didn't leave bed, they would text, want me to come over, and not talk. And sometimes that's exactly what I needed, someone to sit on the floor, scroll through their phone, and just exist in the same space. As my sadness, no pressure, no fixing, just presence, I began to realize that healing wasn't about eliminating the darkness, it was about learning I could live through it. That I could stretch my arms inside it and still be whole. Some days we didn't talk about feelings at all. We just watched movies, took long walks, ate snacks without naming the silence between us, and that, too, was love. Love isn't always deep conversations and shared secrets. Sometimes it's grocery shopping together, it's sending memes at midnight, it's noticing when I start using exclamation points again in text. They noticed everything, but never pointed it out like a prize. They simply held it gently, as if my becoming wasn't something they owned, but something they honored. One rainy afternoon, we sat by the window watching drops race down the glass. I told them, I don't know when I started feeling like I was too much. They said, I don't think it's that you were too much. I think it's that people didn't know how to hold you. I cried. Then not because I was broken, but because someone finally said, eat it. Wasn't that I was too loud, too sensitive, too intense. Tita was that I had been handed to the wrong hands and they dropped me. But now I was being held differently. No grip, no control, just held. That changes you slowly, quietly, but deeply. Kind of change that makes you sit in silence and think, I don't want to go back to who I was. Because this version of me is finally breathing, not performing, not apologizing, just breathing. And I had someone who stayed long enough to hear the change in my breath. That's something sacred. There were days when I still felt afraid of slipping back, of being too much again, of the other shoe dropping. And every time they noticed, without me saying a word, they'd text, I'm not going anywhere. You don't scare me. And I'd believe it a little more each time until those words became my own, till I could look in the mirror and say, I'm not going anywhere either. You don't scare me. I stopped waiting for the darkness to leave and started inviting it to sit beside the light. And somehow they coexisted like the sky holding both storm and sunlight. That's what I had become, not healed, but whole. I used to believe love came with conditions, that it waited at the finish line only after you fixed yourself, only after you became easier, quieter, better. But they never waited for me to be better. They just walked in when I was still unraveling, still unsure if I wanted to be found on. They stayed without asking for anything. I remember one night we were sitting on the rooftop, wrapped in separate blankets, hot tea in hand, and silence between us. Like music, the kind of silence that isn't awkward, just honest. I asked them, why do you care so much? They didn't flinch, didn't act like I had insulted them. They just said, because you exist, and that's enough for me. And for the first time, I let that land inside me without fighting it, without proving it wrong. It didn't shatter me. It softened me, because I had spent years trying to earn what they gave freely. Affection, presence, patience. Now I was learning that real love doesn't make you prove your worth. It just loves even the messy parts, even the complicated hours, even the days when you forget how to smile. I didn't know I could be loved like that. I thought I had to explain myself, to explain the silence, the hesitation, the panic, but they never asked for the backstory. Only for the truth of today. Are you okay? always followed with, "It's okay if the answer is no." That was new, that was rare, that was really. Started answering honestly even when I wasn't sure what I was feeling, even when it came out as "I don't know," or "It's just a heavy day," and every time they said, "Thanks for telling me, I've got you." That was all I ever needed someone to have me, without owning me, without saving me, without trying to erase the darkness. Just be with it. Some people think love means pulling you into the light, but sometimes love is sitting with you in the dark until your eyes adjust and you can finally see you were never alone. That's what they did, and because of them, I started showing up differently, not just with them, but with myself. I stopped apologizing for the days I couldn't explain. I stopped hiding my quiet. Stopped rushing to fill the air with words that didn't feel true. Let myself feel, let myself stay, let myself restand. In that I began to grow, not quickly, not all at once, but deeply, like roots instead of flowers. I told them, "I'm not good at this, at letting people in." They smiled, "You're doing just fine. Look how far you've let me come in already." And I realized they were right without trying, without even noticing I had opened doors I once swore would stay closed, and behind those doors was someone I was starting to like again, not because I was perfect, but because I was honest, present, real. They reminded me that my softness wasn't a weakness, that vulnerability wasn't something to survive, but something to share, and sharing it didn't make people leave, at least not the right ones. They stayed through the fog, through the silence, through the days I couldn't hold eye contact, and the nights I couldn't fall asleep without a light on. They stayed, and so did I, in my own body, in my own story, in my own becoming. I wasn't afraid of myself anymore, because now there was proof that I could be loved without needing to be easy, without needing to be fixed. There was no final moment, no closing scene with dramatic music, no conversation that tied everything into a perfect bow. Healing didn't end with fireworks, it ended quietly, like a soft breath after years of holding it. Didn't become someone new. I became someone true, and they never once asked for a transformation. They just asked for presence, for honesty, for whatever I had to give that day. Even if it was just silence and half a smile, they took it, held it, loved it, and I learned to do the same. I stopped dreading mornings, stopped fearing that familiar ache in my chest. Because even if the ache was still there, I knew now I wasn't the only one holding it. That changes you, knowing someone sees your shadow and doesn't look away, doesn't run, doesn't flinch. They never once said you're too much or you're not enough. Instead, they said, "I'm still here," over and over again, until I believed it. Until I could say it to myself, "I'm still here." There were days I looked in the mirror and didn't hate what I saw, didn't love it, but didn't flinch. That was enough. Some days I even reached out to others. To the world. I responded to texts. I smiled at strangers. I made plans I actually wanted to keep, small things but real. And I started dreaming again, not big dreams, just little ones, like planting herbs on my windowsill, learning to bake the kind of bread that reminds you someone cares, visiting bookstores I used to hide in as a child. They came with me once to that bookstore, showed them the corner I used to sit in, the stack of books I read without buying, the secret worlds I escaped into. They listened like it mattered, like every memory I handed them was something sacred. And when I finished talking, they didn't say, "That's sad," or "Why didn't anyone notice?" They just said, "I'm so glad you made it through." That's what it was, making it through the days when the darkness screamed, through the mornings when I didn't know how to be a person, through the numbness, the fog, the fear. And now here I was, whole, not because I was finished, but because I had stopped hiding the parts of me that weren't. The once said, "Love is seeing someone's mess and not needing to clean it, just choosing to sit in it with them." And they did that again and again and again, till I believed that I could be someone worth sitting beside. One night, I wrote them a letter, didn't send it, just wrote it, said, "Thank you for not needing me to shine, for loving the version of me I thought no one could, for making the darkness feel less like a punishment and more like a place where something tender could grow. I didn't think I could come back, not fully, not honestly, but I did. And you were there every quiet step of the way. You didn't just help me survive, you helped me remember how to live. That letter still sits in my drawer, unsent, unspoken, but alive in every small thing I do differently now, every gentle thought I give myself, and every kind boundary I hold, and every day I choose to stay, because now I know the value of staying, not just for someone else, but for myself. I stayed even when it hurt, even when it felt like no one would notice if I disappeared again, even when the world moved on without me. Stayed because someone taught me that staying doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like breathing, crying, getting up slowly, answering one text, opening one window, and still that counts, that matters. They matter, they always will, because when I was a shadow, they didn't ask me to be light, they just stood beside me. So I wouldn't feel alone in the dark. Hand, that is the kind of love that doesn't need to be explained, just remembered forever.